It's great to be here, and we actually joined by two great keynote speakers. I'm so looking forward to this session, and they'll give a talk on emotion, AI, and also expression, but on two very different angles. And I'm very excited to first introduce Jamie, and then joining me as a moderator, we have Jennifer Healy, who will introduce Rana later on. And Jamie and Rana will give a 30 minutes talk each. And please don't leave right at the end of the talks because we will have a very interesting discourse with both Jamie and Rana. And please post your questions as as you hear the talks. So let me first introduce Jamie. So Jamie Pennebaker is the Regent Centennial Professor of Liberal Arts and Professor of Psychology. He's an internationally recognized social psychologist who's endlessly curious about human nature. And he and his students are exploring natural language use, group dynamics, and personality in both laboratory and real settings. Um, I actually have used one of very famous tool released by Jamie, which is LIWC, a gold standard tool for sentiment analysis. And his early work actually found keeping secrets can make people sick. And later, he's actually been working also about expression and text, even during this COVID-19 pandemic. So Jamie will give a talk on translating emotional experiences into words, expressive writing, interviewing, and COVID. There you go, Jamie. Yep, the floor is yours.
It's a real honor to be here, and I'm also honored to share the stage with Rana as well. Uh, it's it's important for you to appreciate that I am not a computer scientist. I'm a social psychologist, and so I'm coming from a somewhat different perspective. Uh, I'll be honest with you. I hate PowerPoint, but I thought I'll put up a just a minute here. Put up just a little bit, partly because I like the picture. What I want to talk about is thinking about the nature of emotion and how it's related to the world of language. And as a very brief overview of what I'll be talking about, I'll start off with the idea of expressive writing and go into a number of issues that I think are going to be relevant for today's discussion. A little bit of background. I started this world many years ago looking at the nature of physical symptoms, how we come to know how we feel. And I was interested in how do you know if you're angry or happy or hungry or that you have an upset stomach? What are the cues that we are using in our bodies to try to understand who we are? And one of the depressing things I discovered was that people are really horrible at knowing what's going on in their body. So, for example, if I ask you to tap your finger at the rate your heart is beating, you're pathetic at it. And your confidence in how good you are at detecting your body might be high, but the more confident you are, we found the worse you are at detecting your internal states. And people are just not that good at it. I'll come back to this in just a minute, but I ended up through a number of flukes discovering that keeping secrets can be really unhealthy for you in terms of your physical and mental health. And because of that, I started an experiment wondering if I brought people in the laboratory and had them write about emotional upheavals, ideally that they talked to others, they had kept secret from others. If they wrote about them for 3 or 4 days, 15 minutes a day, would it have any effect on their physical health? In our initial research we did with students, and we had permission from them to track their student health center records, and we found that writing about traumatic experiences was actually good for their physical and mental health. In fact, they went to the doctor at lower rates, at about half the rates as people in our control conditions. And this phenomenon, this expressive writing phenomenon now has been replicated probably 1,000 times, more than 1,000 times over the last 20 years. But what we didn't know then, and we only have a sense now, is why is it that writing about a traumatic experience is good for you? Well, the one thing that I just assumed at the beginning was that, well, it gave people the opportunity to express emotions. And we had one study where we would have people write about their traumatic experience, focusing just on their emotions or just on what happened or some mixture of the two. And it turns out just expressing emotions made some people feel good, or they said so at least briefly, but it had absolutely no effect on their physical health. And similarly, writing about the facts had no effects either. The only thing that mattered were people who were writing about both the upsetting experience and their emotions. That is, that emotions and the cognitive features of what had happened to them had to be put together. And this gets me to this idea of, how do we think about emotions? Do emotions exist out there as independent entities, or are emotions really a more complex phenomenon? Now, what grew out of this early work on expressive writing was I was trying to understand, and then other labs were trying to understand, why writing works. And multiple studies were done with different theories and great ideas, but nothing seemed to pan out. And at some point, after 3 or 4 years of this research, I thought, geez, I ought to look at what people are writing about. And that turns out to be a complicated problem. And we had judges, we had clinicians read these essays, and now were hundreds of them, and later thousands. But having people read these depressing essays made the reviewers depressed. And it turned out that people who were evaluating these essays didn't even agree on them. So it occurred to me it would make more sense to come up with a computer program to analyze these texts. And this was in the early 90s, and I assumed there'd be such a program. I couldn't find one. And so working with one of my students, we wrote this crude version of the current linguistic inquiry and word count, LIWC, or Luke as I call it. And the idea was it was a dumb program. It would just simply go in and count the percentage of words in a text that were positive emotion, negative emotions. But also we had cognitive words such as understand, realize, know, meaning, words where people are trying to understand something. And as long as you're writing a program like that, it was easy to throw in pronouns and prepositions and parts of speech and so forth. What we discovered, there were 2 or 3 things that we discovered. One was that the people's use of emotions was only weakly related to people's improved physical health. There's a small relationship between the more they used positive emotions when they're writing about a trauma, the more likely they were to show improvements in health. But the effect was really weak. Negative emotions, again, it was a very weak relationship. It was curvilinear, so those who used kind of a moderate level of negative emotions benefited the most. But what was weird was what predicted long-term health much better was people's use of cognitive process words like understand, realize, know, and also causal words like because, cause, effect. In other words, people who were trying to understand why they were feeling the way they were, those words predicted improved physical health. Now, this was about the same time that I was starting to look at Luke kind of more broadly. And we had developed that just at the time that America Online came aboard. Now, I'm a social psychologist, and America Online was the most unbelievable invention in the history of the world because it meant that I could actually download interacting groups and analyze their data that night. And what I started to discover was that language did not work the way I thought at all. I assumed, for example, that men would use words like I, me, and my much more than women. And it was the opposite. I thought that women would use we, us, and our much more than men. It turned out men and women use them at the same rates. I assumed women would use emotion words more. No difference. Uh, I assumed cognitive words, because cause and effect, would be used more by men. No, by women. In other words, everything I thought, all these stereotypes I held about language were false. And I started to realize that these words, these very small words like pronouns and prepositions and articles and other words, actually were tracking, among other things, how people were paying attention to their worlds, how they were paying attention to themselves. So, for example, I words, I, me, and my, reflect a person being self-focused. Now, that all of a sudden, that makes more sense, that women are somewhat more self-focused than are men. They're aware of their internal states more than men are. Now, I wasn't doing this research because I care about the differences between men and women language. I was more interested in just how language works, because sometimes if we're depressed, if we're in physical pain, if we are on the stage and other people are looking at us, we're self-conscious, we all use I words more. And when we're telling the truth and we're being reflective, we use I words more. And if we're lying, we tend to use them less. But the point is that the words that were the most reflective were this group of words that we call function words. And function words are a group of words that exist in all languages. They include pronouns, I, me, he, she, etc., prepositions, to, of, for, auxiliary verbs, am, is, have, had, negations, no, not, and articles, a, and the, etc. What's interesting is these are the smallest, most forgettable, most worthless words we can imagine. Nevertheless, they account for about 60% of all the words we read, we hear, we say. And they're processed in the brain differently, and they can tell us so much about people. And it turns out they're really closely related to emotional experience. Now, this got me now into the emotion world in different ways. And part of it was, I think intuitively, we all think emotion words say a lot about emotional state. And if you look at the history of computer science and emotion, the world of sentiment analysis has grown into a cottage industry. And it's going on this assumption that our use of emotion words will tell us about a person's emotional state. Now, there's something kind of weird about that. Here we are, human beings, and we have adapted language. Now, we didn't need language to express emotions. And I'm going to bet that language did not evolve for us to express emotions. In other words, language really evolved to express ideas and to express threats and other things like that. We didn't really need it for emotion. In other words, we can express emotion in zillions of different ways. There's something else that's a little bit puzzling and let's call it a little bit disturbing. And that is, if you look at the various ways we can measure emotions, and I've spent, my early career, I spent a lot of time looking at autonomic measures. I looked at skin conductance and heart rate and blood pressure and muscular things, EMG, or looking at facial muscles, or a little bit in EEG and other kinds of measures. Here's the weird thing. All of these different measures don't correlate very highly with each other. And then we can also get self-reports. How are you feeling? To what degree are you happy, sad, etc.? Self-reports are not highly correlated with any of these physiological measures. And then we move into the language measures. And the language measures are not really related to self-reports, and they're not very related to the physiology, and judges' ratings aren't related. What the hell is emotion? Where is it? Now, this gets to a fundamental question within the field. What is the standard of emotion? If I'm coming up with some kind of measure, what should I compare it with? Well, I can tell you what social psychologists do. They use self-reports. Self-reports. God gave us self-reports, and that is the gold standard. Well, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. How many times have you asked your spouse, your roommate, are you angry? And they, no. Do they think they're angry? Well, briefly they might, but we know they're angry. And certain other markers would pick it up. And anybody who spent time with another human knows that people are self-deceptive a lot, or sometimes they just don't know what their emotions are. And this gets at another really ugly problem. We don't even know what an emotion is. And by the way, this is not a computer science problem. This is not an affective computing problem, and it's not a social psychology. It's a science and knowledge problem, because part of the problem is emotion is not just emotion. And I know that sounds a little bit weird. Another way to think about this, if you ask, and I've done this, if you go through and you ask people to write essays, write about an experience that made you incredibly angry or incredibly happy, etc. And people do it. You can go through and you can analyze the words, and you do find that when people are writing about an angry story, they use more anger words. Big deal. A sad one, more sad words, big deal. But you can go, and that's using just emotion words. But if you throw out all the emotion words and you analyze them for other dimensions, for example, function words, pronouns, prepositions, articles, etc., you can do almost as good a job at discriminating which emotional state they're writing about. In other words, if I'm sad or depressed, I use I words at much higher rate. If I'm happy, I use we words more. If I'm angry, I tend to use you and they and them more. In other words, these function words are also discriminating emotional experience. Now, here's the interesting question that I want to leave you with just at this point, and that is the whole nature that emotion, in terms of if we're looking at language use, is a mix. In fact, emotional experience is a mix of what we're thinking about, cognitions. It's a marker of our social context that we're in, social and cultural context. It's related to our physiology, and it's related to emotion. And all of these things are interrelated. Emotion is not a phenomenon by itself. It is part of all of these other contexts. So we have to think of emotion on a much broader level than we have historically. And that's really kind of my central issue at this point. Now, I want to move this to a case study. And the case study is COVID. I have a history of my research of being somewhat of an ambulance chaser. And so if there's something that is bad happening in the culture, to me, that is something exciting, because it allows me to start to look at major life events that we share with others. And I've done this with September 11th. I've done it with assassinations. I've done it with natural disasters. But COVID is one of the most interesting ones I've studied, because usually when there's some kind of traumatic experience that's a cultural one, what we do is we go and we spend a lot of time with others. And there's a lot of research suggesting that other animals do the same thing. If there's some kind of shared threat, they tend to flock together, that they run in packs, they're more tightly connected. And that seems to be true with shared disasters. COVID is one of the most interesting, because here is a shared disaster but the rule is you can't be close to other people. And I was curious how all of this worked. So let me share this screen again. Here's a brief summary of what I've just talked about. Yep. Okay, there we go. That looks great. Okay, so here we are. So the model that I was working on was one that's more an attentional model. And you'll see that the idea is the degree that we pay attention to COVID should tell us the degree to which we are aware of and various processes and processes all kick in together. So the degree to which we're paying attention to COVID, the more that it should affect our emotions, cognitive processes, and social connections. And as a doff of the hat to Rana, also facial expressions. But the point is emotions, cognitive processes, social connections, they're all interconnected. And we can make causal arguments that emotions cause social connections, et cetera. But frankly, I think that's they're all part of the same complex creatures that each of us really are. So in this research project, what we've done is we've approached it two ways. In this project, by the way, that is being run by my senior graduate student, Ashwini Ashakumar, and I want to be sure she gets credit for this. She's a phenomenal student. In any case, what we've done is we've run this in two ways. The first is we've done been part of an international group with doing surveys, and we've been passing out surveys. It was weekly. Now we're starting to move to monthly. We probably have 30,000 people who have completed these surveys, asking them about a number of features of how they were dealing with it. The other is a project within the United States looking at Reddit. We've had about 20 cities, 20 of the largest Reddit community cities, including Austin, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, et cetera, and tracking them for the last 2 years, or last year and a half, looking at how they have reacted to COVID and the way that they've used language to get a sense of these various processes. So for starters, if we're going to be looking at, so I'll be talking primarily about the Reddit data. And I'm going to start off just with this, in the degree to which people are paying attention to COVID. And this is referring to the percentage of people that say the word COVID, coronavirus, or a couple of other words within a given post. And you'll see that 10% of all posts now in these city Reddits make reference to COVID. And obviously, they don't actually say it, but the topic is still relevant to it. And what's lovely about this is just looking at the timestamps. So for example, you'll recall that we all went into isolation essentially around March 12th, which is this middle bar here. All the rumors started to occur as the stock market dropped to the 25th of February, and the first death was announced in Washington State around the 29th. And you'll see this goes to the end of May, and the degree to which people were obsessed with COVID remained pretty static. In terms of emotions, the gray lines refer to what was happening in 2019. The blue lines are 2020. And the emotion that's the most striking is anxiety. I have never seen anxiety numbers this high. In other words, a very high percentage relative to other contexts of words that people are using is anxiety. And COVID was and is an anxiety relevant problem. And you'll see that even after things dropped back to kind of a new baseline at the beginning of April or mid-April, you'll see that number has remained fixed, and it's much higher than it was a year. Anger is one also that's been interesting, which was there's a big drop in anger, which actually this surprises many people. However, it didn't surprise me because we found this in almost every other thing that we've looked at, that there was a big drop in anger when COVID started, and it maintained itself until May. And I should say that anger changes a lot beginning the end of May with the George Floyd murder, and that anger words are now elevated compared to before. And then the other interesting negative emotion is there's been a gradual increase in sadness over the course of COVID until the end of May. Positive emotion does kind of what you expect, that there is a significant drop in once we are all in isolation. Now, emotion, as I say, is only part of the story, that there's a lot more going on in our heads than emotional experience. What I'm particularly interested in are two different dimensions of cognition. Cognition can be broken into two ways of thinking. Uh, Daniel Kahneman talked about system 1 and system 2 thinking. System 2 thinking is this logical, formal way that we think. We are thinking in hierarchical, really fixed kind of way. With Luke, we've been able to come up with an algorithm that captures this fairly well, and we call it analytic thinking. And I'd like you to look at those numbers on the left. Analytic thinking, again, is logical, hierarchical, formal thinking. And what you see is once COVID kicks in, there is an unbelievably large drop. I've never seen a drop that big in any large sample before that dropped primarily once we started to go into isolation and is only slowly coming back. You can almost think of this as we as a culture became somewhat stupid during this time. We became much less logical and formal, primarily because we were having to deal with all of the other things that's going on. And these other things that are going on are related to working memory. Now, working memory is if you're under stress, you're constantly thinking, do I have a problem here? Do I have a problem there? Oh, I don't have, where am I going to get toilet paper? How am I going to get my work done? I'm trying to do work. My kids are here at home, etc. You are constantly obsessing and thinking. And that we see in these cognitive process words. There's some other research showing that cognitive process words are markers of working through something. And what we find is that, again, especially once we hit the isolation phase, or when we are confined to home, people are now thinking more and more about other issues. They're constantly processing. Interestingly, when cognitive process words are higher, people tend to, because working memory is being eaten up, they tend to dream more, and many people, I suspect, in this virtual room had experiences like this. Now, one of the things that we've become interested in that I wanted to just mention very briefly, given the degree to which COVID has disrupted the world, it's been interesting to my group to try to find out, would it be possible to come up with an intervention that could help people cope with it? And so what my group did is to create a website that's essentially an expressive writing intervention. And feel free to go and try it out. The idea behind it is that it's simply a group of interventions where people are essentially told, if you're interested in writing about COVID, here is a platform for doing it. And there are different prompts that you can try. And what we're just evaluating is, do people find this beneficial? And I would urge you to, if you're interested in this, to check it out. At the same time, over the last several years, I've collaborated quite a bit with Rada Mielchia at University of Michigan. And Rada and I have always been interested in the links between words and psychological upheavals in people's lives. And Rada has also befriended a group that I've become interested in who are looking at motivational interviewing. And working with one of her graduate students, Charlie Welch, we developed a method that we're calling expressive interviewing. And the idea here is to have an agent that interviews you in an emotional way. So if you go to that website, what you can try out is will essentially ask you, so tell me about the issues you're dealing with COVID? How does this make you feel? How is this related to issues going on in your family or whatever? And it's using a reasonably smart technology that can help guide people's questions. This is still in the early development phases, but our initial findings have been quite promising. And we're now doing this for better, an area that I think is even more promising. As you can see, the work that we are just the things we're discovering with the analysis of language are wildly exciting, but they go so far beyond traditional ways of thinking about sentiment. That language is a window into the way people are thinking, and it helps us to get a better sense of emotion experience. That emotion is not just the subjective experience of emotion. Emotion is this much broader conception that touches all of us. So let me stop here and thank you all very much.